In the summer of 1995, two groups of technology executives sat down together in a conference room in Silicon Valley. One company was the most powerful software corporation on Earth. The other had just invented what millions of people were using to navigate the internet. The meeting was supposed to be about cooperation. What Microsoft actually proposed, according to court documents filed later by the United States government, was something closer to extortion. Microsoft told Netscape to stop competing on Windows, cede that market entirely to Internet Explorer. In return, Netscape could have the rest of the world. Netscape said no. What happened next took 3 years, 2 federal courtrooms, and a landmark antitrust ruling to fully document. And at the center of it all was a single phrase, a phrase that came, according to sworn testimony, from inside Microsoft itself. A phrase that described in plain language exactly what Microsoft intended to do to the company that had dared to say no. That phrase was cut off Netscape's air supply. And here is the part that makes this story matter far beyond 1995. The strategy used to destroy Netscape did not die with it. Stay with me, because before this video is over, you will see that same 3-step playbook being run again right now. On technology you use today. On the open source tools that millions of developers, including Linux developers, depend on. On May 18, 1998, the United States Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft Corporation. When Assistant Attorney General Joel Klein stepped in front of cameras to explain why, he did not use the government's own language to describe what Microsoft had done. He quoted Microsoft's own words from the DOJ's official statement, submitted to the public record that day. When Netscape refused, Microsoft then used its Windows monopoly to, in Microsoft's own words, cut off Netscape's air supply. Read that again. The United States government went to court armed with Microsoft's own internal documents, and those documents contained that phrase. This was not a hostile characterization invented by prosecutors. This was the language Microsoft executives had used among themselves when discussing what to do about Netscape. The government simply held it up for the world to see. The scope of what Microsoft had actually done to Netscape by that point was staggering. Microsoft had bundled its Internet Explorer browser directly into Windows and given it away for free, making it economically impossible for Netscape to charge for its browser, which had been the company's primary source of revenue. Microsoft had pressured PC manufacturers to pre-install Internet Explorer on every machine that ran Windows, and made clear that manufacturers who resisted risked losing their Windows licensing agreements. Microsoft had entered exclusive deals with major internet platforms, including AOL, specifically designed to push Netscape out. By 1997, Internet Explorer's market share had climbed from near zero to a position where it was threatening to make Netscape irrelevant. A company that had once defined what it meant to navigate the internet was being systematically cut off from the users it needed to survive. And the name that appeared on nearly every piece of internal evidence submitted to the court, on nearly every controversial email, his name was Paul Maritz. And what happened when he testified under oath about the words attributed to him is one of the most important moments in this entire story. I will get to that shortly. To understand what Microsoft was so afraid of, you need to understand what Netscape actually was in 1994 and 1995, and why it terrified the most powerful software company on the planet. Netscape Communications was founded in 1994 by Jim Clark and Mark Andreessen, the co-creator of Mosaic, the browser that had first brought the World Wide Web to ordinary people. Netscape's browser, called Navigator, was not just a piece of software. It was the lens through which most of the world first experienced the internet. By 1995, Netscape Navigator held roughly 70 to 80% of the browser market. The company went public in August of 1995, and its stock price doubled on the first day of trading, one of the most dramatic IPOs in the history of American technology. But the reason Netscape terrified Microsoft had nothing to do with market share numbers. It had to do with what Netscape represented as a platform. Netscape was beginning to position its browser as a kind of operating system in its own right, a universal layer that could run applications across any computer, any operating system, regardless of whether it ran Windows. If Netscape succeeded in building that layer, Microsoft's control of the Windows desktop, the foundation of its entire business empire, would become irrelevant. your operating system would stop mattering. The browser would be what mattered. Bill Gates understood this threat clearly and quickly. In May 1995, he circulated an internal memo that has since become famous in the technology industry, titled the Internet Tidal Wave. In it, he described the Internet as the most important development since the IBM PC and directed Microsoft to redirect its resources accordingly. Gates wrote that he was assigning the Internet the highest level of importance. The June 1995 meeting between Microsoft and Netscape followed directly from that recognition. Microsoft sent a delegation that included Paul Maritz, then one of the company's most senior platform executives, along with other leaders. What was discussed in that room has been extensively documented in court filings. The proposition, as recorded in evidence submitted during the trial, was explicit. Netscape should not compete with Microsoft on the Windows platform. Microsoft would develop the browser technology for Windows. Netscape would be free to pursue the rest of the market. There was a word for what Microsoft was proposing, and it was not partnership. It was market division, which is illegal under United States antitrust law. Netscape CEO Jim Barksdale later testified in the trial. He described a company that left that meeting and understood, with unusual clarity, that it was now a target. What none of them fully anticipated was how methodical the campaign against them would be. But the trail of internal evidence that prosecutors would eventually lay before a federal judge told that story in Microsoft's own words. The trial that changed everything began in October 1998. The judge assigned to the case was United States District Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson, a federal judge in Washington, D.C. The lead attorney for the Department of Justice was David Boies, one of the most accomplished litigators in the country. The government's most important witness was not a Netscape executive. He was a senior vice president at Intel, a man named Stephen Maggette. Maggette had attended meetings with Microsoft executives during the period in question, and he had taken notes. Those notes contained what became the most quoted words in the entire trial. According to Maggette's sworn testimony, Microsoft had described a strategy built on three words: embrace, extend, extinguish. Embrace an open standard. Extend it with proprietary features that only Microsoft's software could handle. Then extinguish any competitor that depended on the original open standard, because users would now be locked into Microsoft's version. Maggette testified that this was the framework Microsoft had applied, and intended to apply further, to Netscape and to the web itself. And then there was the air supply quote. Maggette testified that Microsoft, in his presence, had described its intent to cut off Netscape's air supply. The phrase was attributed to Paul Maritz. When Maritz himself took the stand, he denied saying those exact words. He was on nearly every piece of documentary evidence submitted as an exhibit. He denied the specific phrasing. The judge weighed the testimony of both men, along with the documentary record, and made his findings. Maggette's decision to testify was not uncomplicated. Intel was a major Microsoft partner. Intel CEO Craig Barrett reportedly told Maggette not to testify. According to reporting on the trial, Maggette's response to his own chief executive was to tell him, in language that has become something of Silicon Valley legend, to pound sand. In November 1999, Judge Jackson issued his findings of fact. They were detailed, specific, and unsparing. Microsoft had used its Windows monopoly illegally. The company had engaged in anti-competitive conduct designed to harm Netscape and to eliminate threat the browser represented to Windows. The findings did not mince language. Then in June of 2000, Judge Jackson went further. He ordered Microsoft broken into two separate companies, one to sell Windows, one to sell applications. It was the most significant antitrust remedy ordered against an American corporation since the breakup of AT&T. And within a year, it was overturned. Not because the judge was wrong about the facts, but because of what he had done outside the courtroom. And that part of the story is not as well known as it should be. Judge Jackson, while the case was still active, had spoken extensively to journalists. He had given interviews in which he compared Microsoft's executives to street gangs and made other remarks that were later cited as prejudicial. The United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit found that Jackson had violated the Code of Conduct for United States judges by speaking to the press during an active case. On those grounds, the appeals court vacated the breakup order and removed Jackson from the case. Here is the critical distinction that often gets lost in how this outcome is reported. The appeals court did not overturn Judge Jackson's findings of fact. The determination that Microsoft was an illegal monopoly, that it had engaged in anti-competitive conduct, that it had used its dominance to harm competitors, those findings stood. What was overturned was the remedy, the punishment, not the verdict. The case was remanded to a new judge, and then the political landscape shifted. In January 2001, the Bush administration took office. The new leadership of the Department of Justice moved to settle rather than pursue the breakup. In November 2001, the government and Microsoft reached a settlement. Microsoft would face behavioral restrictions, requirements about how it shared its Windows APIs with third parties, for example, but no structural breakup. No company divided in two. 9 states that had been co-plaintiffs in the case refused to accept the settlement and continued their own legal challenges, but the federal case was effectively over. Netscape, meanwhile, had already ceased to be a serious competitor. AOL had acquired the company in December 1998, at the height of the trial, for $4.2 billion. That sounds like a substantial sum until you consider what Netscape's trajectory had been before Microsoft's campaign began. By the time of the acquisition, Netscape's market position had been so severely damaged that it was already a fraction of what the company might otherwise have been worth. The Netscape browser struggled on for several more years under AOL's ownership, but it was never again a force in the market. In 2008, it was officially discontinued. Microsoft won, completely, at no meaningful cost, and the strategy that won it, embrace, extend, extinguish, did not retire with Netscape. The human cost of what was done, and what it set in motion, is something your own experience may illuminate more sharply than any court document. I will show you why in a moment. Stephen Maggette did not have to testify. He knew that. He was a senior executive at Intel, a company that depended on its relationship with Microsoft. His own CEO told him to stay out of it. He went anyway. He sat in a federal courtroom and gave sworn testimony against the most powerful software company in the world, knowing it would cost him professionally, knowing Intel would be furious, knowing that the phrase "pound sand to a sitting CEO" tends to follow a man for the rest of his career. Why does that matter? Because the story of the Microsoft Netscape trial is frequently told as a story about companies and market share percentages and legal theory. But Maggette's decision to walk into that courtroom was a decision made by a human being who believed that what Microsoft had done was wrong enough to say so under oath, on the record, in front of the world, at personal cost. The attorney who called him to the stand, David Boies, later described Maggette as an extremely conscientious, capable, and honest witness. That description of a man who told his own boss to pound sand in defense of what he believed to be the truth is worth sitting with for a moment. Now consider what was actually lost when Netscape was destroyed. In 1994 and 1995, the browser was the most significant new piece of consumer technology most people had ever encountered. Netscape did not simply provide access to the web. It was shaping what the web became. Its engineers were making fundamental decisions about how websites were built, how information was presented, how commerce and communication would work online. When Microsoft concentrated that power in a single company, it did not simply win a market. It determined the direction of the internet for the better part of a decade. Internet Explorer, once it had eliminated its primary competitor, stagnated. The browser wars that eventually reignited, with Firefox then Chrome, did not truly begin until well into the 2000s. The years in between, the years when Internet Explorer held near total dominance of the browser market, are widely regarded by web developers and technology historians as a period of technological stagnation. Innovation slowed, standards fragmented. Developers spent enormous amounts of time working around Internet Explorer's proprietary quirks rather than building new things. That is the human cost of a monopoly that went unchecked. Not just a company destroyed, a decade of slower progress. And if you are watching this because you have lost confidence in Microsoft, if you are the kind of person who feels that Windows has become something different from what it once was, something that serves Microsoft's interests more than yours, then this next part is addressed directly to you. There is a case to be made that the Microsoft antitrust trial, despite ending without a breakup, changed the technology industry for the better. The behavioral restrictions placed on Microsoft as part of the settlement did open Windows APIs to more third-party developers. The public airing of Microsoft's internal documents and strategies exposed the embrace, extend, extinguish playbook and made it harder for any large company to run that same play without being recognized. The trial arguably contributed to a culture shift inside Microsoft itself. The company that emerged from the early 2000s was measurably more cautious about how it treated competitors, and its eventual pivot toward genuine cooperation with open-source software under CEO Satya Nadella is a real and documented change. That is the optimistic case. The pessimistic case is harder to dismiss. In 2018, Microsoft acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion. GitHub is the platform where the majority of the world's open-source software, including the Linux kernel, including the tools that run most of the internet, is hosted and developed. In other words, Microsoft now owns the infrastructure on which Linux itself is built. Since the acquisition, Microsoft has integrated its Copilot AI assistant deeply into GitHub. Using Copilot at full capacity requires a Microsoft account. It collects developer data. It creates dependencies between GitHub users and Microsoft's cloud ecosystem. Critics who follow open-source development closely, including commenters on channels like this one, have noted that this sequence follows a recognizable pattern. Microsoft adds proprietary AI tools and account requirements that create new dependencies. Extinguish. The question that has not yet been answered, but that an increasing number of developers are asking out loud. The honest answer is that we do not know yet whether the GitHub acquisition represents a genuine commitment to open-source development or a long-term strategy to control the infrastructure underlying it. What we do know, what a federal court documented in sworn testimony and submitted evidence, is that Microsoft has run this exact playbook before. We watched it happen to Netscape in real time, and we only fully understood what we had watched when the internal documents were read into the court record. The question your audience should be asking is not whether Microsoft has changed. Companies can change. The question is whether the structural incentives that made it rational to cut off Netscape's air supply in 1995 are still present today. And the answer to that question is visible in who controls GitHub, who controls the AI tools being built into developer infrastructure, and who controls the cloud services that an increasing share of open-source projects depend on. Both cases, the optimistic and the pessimistic, deserve to be taken seriously. Certainty in either direction is not warranted by the available evidence, but informed skepticism, of the kind that a federal judge once brought to bear on internal Microsoft documents, is entirely warranted. In the summer of 1995, Netscape said no to Microsoft. It refused to cede its market, refused to accept the terms of a proposed arrangement that federal prosecutors would later characterize as illegal. For its refusal, it was, in the words used by the United States government, drawn from Microsoft's own documents, cut off. Stephen McGeady walked into a courtroom and said so under oath at personal cost, because he believed the truth mattered. Judge Thomas Penfield Jackson found Microsoft guilty of being an illegal monopoly. The breakup was overturned on a procedural violation. The settlement was soft, and Netscape was discontinued in 2008. That is how the story ended in the courtroom. How the larger story ends, whether the embrace, extend, extinguish strategy now being applied to the infrastructure of open-source development produces a different outcome or the same one is still being written. The next video in this series takes that question further. We are going to look specifically at what Microsoft's acquisition of GitHub has meant for the Linux ecosystem, what has changed, what developers are saying, and what the documented evidence actually shows about whether the open-source community is facing a version of the same threat Netscape faced 30 years ago. If this video raised questions for you, that one will take them seriously. If you watched this to the end, you already understand why this story matters. It is not history for history's sake. It is a documented record of how a monopoly behaves when it decides a competitor needs to be extinguished. And that record is worth knowing.